Welcome to another edition of Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani. This week we're back in Ukraine as Russia bombards the country in a fresh wave of attacks. Cities that had already been a target for the Russian missiles in recent months, Kyiv, Kharkiv and Odessa were hit. As of Sunday, much of the country was under an emergency blackout after missiles hit power infrastructure in several cities. Meanwhile, here in Nigeria, the Ukrainian Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development and the Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food were in Abuja meeting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jeffrey Onyema. Now, according to the minister's Twitter handle, the delegation was in Nigeria to discuss the export of grains from Ukraine to Nigeria and the establishment of grain hubs in the country. I'll be speaking with a professor of political science and former dean of the University of Ibadan, Professor Femi Otubanjo, on who has a vantage position in the war in Ukraine and Nigeria's relations with the country. That's Diplomatic Channel in a wrap. But first, a quick check on other discussions in diplomatic circles.
The mayor of New York, Eric Adams, has told migrants at the border with Mexico that there is no room in the city for them. Mr. Adams had traveled to the border city of El Paso, where he met a busload of them being sent to America's most populous city. The visit is unprecedented, as busloads of migrants have been shipped north to New York and other cities by Republican-run states. It has exacerbated a housing crisis in New York and a worsening homeless crisis in the city.
Our cities are being undermined, and we don't deserve this. Migrants don't deserve this. And the people who live in the cities don't deserve this. We expect more from our national leaders to address this issue in a real way.
China has called on countries to cancel discriminatory measures against travelers from China after the country partially relaxed visa suspension from some travelers from Japan and South Korea. Beijing has issued a small number of visas for some diplomatic, public and emergency business travelers after the suspension to prepare for the normalization of transportation when the two countries ease border controls. After 3 years of isolation from the outside world, China on January the 8th dropped quarantine mandates for inbound visitors in a move expected to eventually also stimulate outbound travel. But concerns about China's outbreak has prompted more than a dozen countries to demand negative COVID test results from people arriving from China. The South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol on Sunday arrived in the United Arab Emirates for talks with his counterpart Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. Yoon's arrival kicks off a 4-day visit during which he will address the UAE-Korea Forum and meet with state officials and visit developmental projects. Discussions are expected to center on nuclear energy, climate change, health, the space sector, smart agriculture, and culture.
Welcome back. Ukraine has been heavily bombarded by Russian missiles over the last couple of days, yet its soldiers and people are defiant. But Russia is determined to win this war. Here's a wrap of main events in the country over the last few days.
It has been another night into the morning of bombardments in Ukraine. Several cities were hit in the overnight attack, Dnipro. In the aftermath, authorities find that 5 people were killed and at least 60 others were wounded, including 12 children. Residents helped official rescue workers in looking for survivors trapped under the rubble of what used to be a 9-story apartment block. Video posted by the State Emergency Service of Ukraine showed rescuers working into the night to find and rescue residents of the building, parts of which were reduced to rubble. At least 15 people were rescued after being buried under a section of the apartment block. A number of cities were hit in Russia's latest wave of missiles, including Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa. A Russian rocket hit a residential area in the village of Kupliv in the region just outside Kyiv. The rocket left a large blast crater and damaged windows and roofs in several privately owned houses in the village, which is about 30 kilometers away from the capital. Kiev residents took shelter underground as the air alarm sirens blared above ground. President Volodymyr Zelensky appealed to the West to supply more weapons to prevent further deaths from what he describes as Russian terror. Saturday's attack comes as Western powers consider sending battle tanks to Kiev and ahead of a meeting of Ukraine's allies in Ramstein in Germany next Friday, where governments will announce their latest pledges of military support. The UK has already announced it will send Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine to help the country's defense. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says the Challengers, the British Army's main battle tank, will help Kiev's forces push Russian troops back. Russia said that providing more weapons to Ukraine will lead to intensified operations and more civilian casualties. Meanwhile, Russia is considering raising the upper age limit for citizens to be conscripted into the armed forces as soon as this spring. President Putin gave his backing in December to Defense Ministry proposals to raise the age for mandatory military service to cover Russian citizens aged 21 to 30, rather than the current range of 18 to 27.
Joining me now to discuss how far this war has come and Nigeria's relations with Ukraine is Professor of Political Science and former Dean at the University of Ibadan, Professor Femi Otunbanjo. He joins me from his residence in Lagos. Professor Otunbanjo, thank you for joining me on the program today.
Thank you for having me.
I want to begin with your thoughts on the meeting that the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jeffrey Onyema, had with the Ukrainian Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development, Dr. Mohammed Mahmoud, and the Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food, Mykola Soliski, in Abuja to discuss the export of grain to Nigeria. Now, I remember the Ukrainian Foreign Minister had mentioned this at a press briefing just a few months ago, that shipments of grain will be coming to some African countries this year, and the discussions were ongoing as to what sort of grains each country needs. When asked why, Mr. Dmitry Kuleba said that it was because Ukraine had once gone through a time of famine in the past and made a vow not to relive the experience. Isn't it interesting, Professor, that even during a war, the embattled country is still engaging in this sort of goodwill?
Yes, there's nothing strange about it. First and foremost, you must understand that Ukraine and Nigeria are not at war. So they still remain friendly countries. Nothing has changed about their relationship. What may have been added to it is perhaps pressure on Nigeria to swing one way or the other in favor of the combatants in the Russia-Ukraine war. So, apart from the fact that we are not at war, so diplomacy continues. Even when we're at war, even between Russia and Ukraine, they are talking. Diplomacy is a relentless element of international relations. It never stops. In fact, if it stops, then that's the end of the world. Because when you are fighting, you are looking for an exit from the fight. That exit will always be through negotiation, through diplomacy. So there's nothing really strange that Ukraine, that is involved in the war, is talking to several countries of the world in order to protect its foreign policy objectives, particularly, as was mentioned, to protect its food supply and also to protect its trade, because Ukraine is one of the leading grain sellers in the world, sells grains to most countries of the world. And the fact that we are suffering from high cost of bread is a testimony to the fact that there's a shortage of grains coming out of Ukraine. And so, from the point of view of their trade, from the point of view of their own food security and our own food security, I think that countries continue to talk to each other, and I'm happy that Nigeria also is talking to Ukraine.
Now, while there's not much that Nigeria can do for Ukraine during this period of war, one of the things, I guess, is probably, that partnership on export of grain. What other kind of support can Nigeria provide Ukraine at this time?
Well, Nigeria has not taken side in this war. Nigeria has attempted to be on the side of peace. And that's part of our foreign policy tradition. A commitment to global peace, and then respect for the sovereignty of all nations. For the part of that respect, Nigeria voted to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine at the beginning. But Nigeria's role today is to seek for peace, is to see how this war can end. The way it is going, it's gone between February and now, it's 11 months of war, and there's no end in sight. Just when you think that things were going to stop, it escalates. So Nigeria's role is to continue to be a powerful voice in the demand for this war to end and for there to be peace between the two nations. Other than that, taking sides with one nation or the other means nothing, because we cannot really offer much in terms of logistic support. So our best bet, which will enhance our own status in the international system, is to be in the forefront of the search for peace.
In the meantime, the Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov says his country has become a de facto member of the NATO alliance. I believe this was why the war started in the first place, Ukraine's proposed membership of NATO. And he says this is because they have weaponry and the understanding of how to use it. This weaponry is coming from Western countries that are members of NATO. He's talking about the tanks and the fighter jets that are provided by Western partners to help Ukraine fight the war. Would you consider this a careless statement, or is Ukraine indeed a de facto member of NATO by virtue of the military aid and support is received from NATO countries?
Well, it's not a careless statement. It's a statement of propaganda by a defense minister of Ukraine, always wanting to ginger NATO countries to increase their support for his country. It's to the extent that those ones are taken in by this flattery, then it becomes dangerous. But I can see that NATO countries have tried as much as possible to keep their distance, in spite of the urging. Zelensky and people are trying to urge NATO countries to come in to the fray, to give them aircraft, to do this and that. But we know the danger of that. We know the danger of classifying Ukraine as a NATO country. That means that an attack on it will become an attack on other members, which means they can respond. They will necessarily have to respond to protect one of their own. But that is not the situation today. It is, like I said, maybe it's de facto, but it's not de jure. By law, it is not a NATO member. It is not, it has not signed all the protocols. It's not even being considered as a NATO member as we speak. But NATO has given its support. The United States and NATO have been solidly behind it. And that's because they are fighting a proxy war against Russia. They are using Ukraine to try to bring down Russia and to weaken Russia as a potential enemy. So to that extent, it may be right to say, well, they are treating us like a NATO member. NATO members are treating Ukraine as if it's one of their own and giving them so much support that even if it were to be a member of NATO, the only thing that would have changed would have been NATO sending troops of their own to augment the Ukrainian defense forces. But Ukraine is not a member of NATO. No amount of weaponry can translate into legal membership. It is a de facto, yes, correctly, because of the way it has been treated by members of NATO, but it is not a NATO member.
Do you think Ukraine will ever become a member of NATO, even after this war?
Yes, it depends. This is the source of the war. As far as Russia is concerned, it is Ukraine's attempt to join NATO that has prompted Russia to feel threatened sufficiently to go to war, to say, I will not accept NATO in my backyard. That is the last frontier between Russia and the West. And if you are to accept NATO membership for Ukraine, it means that.
And now back to my interview with Professor Otubanjo on the war in Ukraine. Well, keeping that in mind, I wanted to talk about Russia's recent bombardment of Ukraine in the past few days, especially. Um, we've seen, a lot of Russian missiles running into Ukraine, hitting targets. On Sunday, there were targets hitting Kyiv, in Odessa, in Kharkiv. Do you think that's an indication that the Russians are frustrated since the war has not already ended, with Ukraine being subservient to Russia or Ukraine giving in to Russia's demands?
Yeah, you see, we must always recognize that distinction between a battle and a war. Russia has lost many battles. Russian troops have not done as well as the world expected them to do. Yes, the world expected their troops to be more professional, the Russian supply line to be more efficient, and their generals to be more strategically equipped. But they have shown failures that were not expected, failures of supply and tactics. And so, failure in battles. But that is not failure in the war. It was one, I think Churchill, one of the British generals during the Second World War, who said that the French are good at winning battles, but losing the war. So you can win all the battles in the war. The purpose objective is to win the war. And Ukraine has done very well in holding back Russia, in driving Russia from some of those Donetsk regions and so on. But what it means is that Russia will go back and reorganize its forces, rethink its strategies. And that's what is happening. The bombardment was to show that we are coming back. We have not given up. We've lost territories, and now they have started gaining territories. The last report that they gained the town of Soledar in the Donetsk region, which will lead to them to be able to capture more towns. First, Bakhmut, a town called Bakhmut, which you have pockets of Ukrainian troops, and if they're able to close them up there, then the Russians will regain the momentum to fight on. So nobody has lost the war yet, and nobody has won it. And that is the purpose. War is a continuum. The Western powers are continually supplying Ukraine with support because they are fighting. Essentially, the US is fighting a proxy war. They're trying to bring Russia down. And they've always had this idea that no nation should be allowed to rise to superpower status to rival the United States. That is there. That's what we call the Wolfish doctrine, or the Bush doctrine of the 1990s. Now, they are fighting and supplying as long as they can produce weapons and heavy military equipment. They will continue to supply. Their industries will continue to prosper from this war, and so on. And the Russians too will continue to respond accordingly. And so we are going to have a prolonged war, which is not desirable. Because in the end, if Russia feels desperate enough that the West is giving Ukraine some advantage, which it has done in the last 11 months, it might be thinking of a different kind of war. Our prayer is that it will not think that it can resort to nuclear war.
Quickly, Professor, let's talk about the issue of justice and the countries that have called for Russia to face, war crimes charges. They talked about the ICJ or the International Court of Justice coming into this. They talked about the special tribunal. Where do you see how possible do you see this happening, and where do you see justice being placed?
Well, justice in the international system is essentially for the weak. The strong countries don't get to face the consequences of their actions. However, the United States will never leave the International Court of Justice because of its activities right from Vietnam to Korea to Cambodia and to not to talk of in the Gulf in recent years, Afghanistan as well. So the powerful countries do not face consequences of their action. This is a war. this is a war which is being fought, and excesses will occur, bombardments will occur. The Ukrainians themselves will not be innocent of war crimes. So, but the critical point is that Russia is a superpower. Russia is a member of the Security Council. Russia is not going to sit by and allow its generals to be taken to the International Court of Justice to face any kind of consequences for war.
I appreciate your time spent with us. Thank you so much for joining me on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes.
Finally on the program, China's new Foreign Minister Qin Gang has been on a 5-country tour of Africa these last few days. Here's a wrap of what he did while on the continent.
Chad and Zambia.
Mr. Qin Gang was appointed as China's new foreign minister to succeed Wang Yi in late December. Before now, he had been serving as a Chinese ambassador to the United States since July 2021. A month later, he begins a 5-nation tour of Africa, with the first stop being Ethiopia, where he meets with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Both exchange warm greetings, Abiy congratulating Qin on the successful conclusion of the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, and expressing his deep admiration for President Xi Jinping's outstanding leadership and political wisdom. He also said Ethiopia looked forward to strengthening exchanges of experiences and governance with China so as to unite and lead all Ethiopian people to adhere to independence and accelerate the development and revitalization of the country. During his second day in Ethiopia, Foreign Minister Qin refuted allegations that China is creating a so-called debt trap in Africa, saying that it is a narrative trap imposed on China and Africa. Explaining further, he said African countries have in recent years been actively working to promote economic and social development, but insufficient funding has become a major bottleneck to its prosperity and revitalization. He said that as brothers, China and Africa have forged ahead side by side on the path of common development. He would later join the chairperson of the African Union Commission, His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, to inaugurate the headquarters of the African Union's Center for Disease Control in Addis. Foreign Minister Qin's tour then continued to Gabon, where he met President Ali Bongo Ondimba. He conveyed President Xi Jinping's warm greetings to the Gabonese president, noting that China-Gabon relations jointly forged by leaders of older generations of the two countries. Qin said China stands ready to work with Gabon to implement the important consensus reached by the two heads of state, consolidate mutual strategic trust, deepen pragmatic cooperation, and elevate China-Gabon comprehensive cooperative partnership to a higher level. On Friday, he met with Angolan President João Lourenço. Chinese enterprises have made positive contributions to improving Angola's infrastructure and people's livelihood, according to Lourenço, adding that Angola expects to further deepen cooperation with China and welcome more Chinese investments in the country. Later that day, he met with Benin President Patrice Talon. Talon said China had made achievements that attracted worldwide attention after finding the right development path, which is inspiring for other developing countries. Talon said his country looks forward to learning from China's experience and deepening and expanding pragmatic cooperation with China so as to speed up its own development. Qin conveyed President Xi's warm greetings to President Talon, noting that China and Benin always followed the principle of mutual respect and equal treatment over the past 50 years. His tour ended in Egypt, where he said Egypt and China hold strong strategic mutual trust. At a news conference following the meeting, Gang said he discussed coordination on bilateral relations and international and regional issues, as well as implementing previously agreed upon decision taken by the country's two presidents. And this is where we end the program today. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget you can watch previous episodes on youtube.com/channelsweb. Just look out for Diplomatic Channel in the search area. And reach out to me on Twitter at Amarachi_Ubani, on Instagram at Amarachi Ubani, and on Facebook, Ubani Amarachi. I'll see you again next time.